I'm really excited to tell you that the bishop is not on the plane tonight.
He's excited too.
Just get that out of the way immediately.
He's excited too.
But he's a wonderful gift to us, and we're grateful that he's here. And he's going to be speaking to us on the topic of modern theology. I'm just wondering, does this say anything about the political landscape of the church? Wait. Now this is what it's more like. Okay, I'll stop. I always tried to make it as a comedian. I used to. Anyway, let's
We're on the wrong side.
yeah. Let's open with a word of prayer for the bishop, and then we're going to turn it over to him. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for Bishop Sumner. Thank you for his wife Stephanie and their children. We pray your continued blessing upon them. And we ask your blessing upon this evening. We thank you for the good food, the physical food. And we thank you now for the spiritual food that we are going to receive. We pray your blessing upon this talk in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Very much. I talked last week, and I mentioned an article by my friend Ephraim Radner, who was here recently, which was a noted article called Bad Bishops. And his argument went like this. He said, a good bishop, like anybody can, get something out of that. He's kind, and he's friendly, and he's helpful and prayerful. But he said, but a bad bishop is much better, because then you have an opportunity to exercise patience, and you can exercise forbearance. I mean, what kind of patience do you get? So anyway, my forgetting was a wonderful opportunity for me to exercise all kinds of patience and forbearance. So there you go. I apologize. And nowadays in my life, I am always delighted to find the church I'm trying to find on MapQuest, and I roll in, and it is where I think it is, in Denison or, Sulphur Springs, wherever. And then at my age, I'm always delighted if the readings are the readings about which the sermon is. There on out, it's all win. So, this evening, I do want to talk about modern theology, all in one 35-minute stretch. How's that for shortening your theological education period? My idea has been to look at not the issues and conflicts of the life of the church. We spend a lot of time, whatever issue or conflict that may be, worrying about those, but rather step back and look at the reasons and the assumptions behind how things work out in the modern church. So we're trying to go below the things people might like or dislike, whether that's a moral question or a worship question or a church organization question, and go underneath and say, why does the church have these kind of disagreements in the way that they do? The church has always had some kind of disagreement, but why do they happen the way they do? And the idea is to look at that from a lot of angles. What is contemporary culture like, for instance, with youth? How do we think about worship? I believe next week you've got yourself a philosopher who is going to likewise wrap up what happened in the modern world in one argument. So we're trying to go to that other level and look at why things are the way they are. This may seem kind of abstract, but actually what I'm trying to get at is something which is actually quite concrete. Why is it that people seem to be like ships passing in the night? That's what I'm interested in. Why is it that sometimes people aren't actually fighting over the same question, but they seem to be answering different questions and therefore missing each other in the life of the church? To do that, I want to simply tell you a story. It begins in the 17th century. It was then that a number of the changes of social and historical importance took place in the world, such that we find the world as it now is. It was a time of great shifts. You and I live in North America, and it was not that long before that they suddenly found, which is not how Native people would look at it, the Americas, right? People from Europe, with this huge change in how people saw the world and also a change in their economic and even dietary lives. This is the time of enormous change, the 1600s. In the 1600s, the wars of religion had raged for the first half of the century, killing millions of our forebears in Europe. These weren't even wars between Catholics and Protestants, a good solid religious war like that. These were wars between Reformed, Calvinists, and Lutherans over issues of doctrine that it would be hard for me even to describe with clarity. They had left Europe exhausted and disillusioned. The whole idea of nationalism was on the rise, as were great advances in science, or the beginning of advances, all of which had changed how people saw the world. The world seemed like a bigger vista. Meanwhile, there were a number of people who thought all of this bloodshed and fighting between religious groups, all of whom claimed to be Christian, had to end. And there was a move toward the idea of finding some kind of least common denominator, LCD, among Christian groups, on the basis of which they could call a truce. You may have read John Locke, the great British philosopher, who was also an Anglican, and he proposed just such a least common denominator among all religious groups to make peace. His was the existence of God and the hope of an afterlife. Let's just go with the basics and then see if it's a more peaceful common. At the outset, it's helpful to be clear about what exactly it was that traditional Christianity did claim and still claims. It's readily agreed that God, by everyone, whether you were a more traditional type of Christian or people trying to rethink the whole thing in the modern era, and even today, everyone agrees that God is unknowable from our own resources. If you were simply to take a long vacation from work, go to a cabin, and think about God on your own, it is limited how far you can get. He is, after all, God. But traditional Christianity went on to claim that as God, he is capable of speaking, if he so chooses. And to do that in a way that can make himself understood. He not only can speak, he can speak in a way that he knows we will be able to hear. And that was the basis for a lot of traditional theology. God is unknowable, but God can up and say something and can make himself understood. Notice that such a view assumes that God is an agent. He's active. He can do something. Second of all, it was understood that Christianity is not just a matter of thinking certain things, but also certain things that God has done as a result. It is, in fact, often noted, but worth noting, that in the Bible we do find claims to truth, but those claims to truth take place within a story, within a long narrative, right? The Bible thinks certain things are true, but it says them as it tells you a story. And that story was open to different interpretation. And traditionally in Christian theology, one passage could mean several different things at once. At the same time that the whole thing, the big story, was clear. It was going somewhere and you knew who the agent was, namely God. So traditional Christians did believe that there could be multiple layers of tradition. Like the rabbis, you could fight over a passage, you could argue, you could gnaw on it, and it could say something morally, spiritually, literally, something about the end of the world. It could say all those things at once, at the same time that the big story was coherent. You knew where it was going. My claim is very simple. This claim is within a story of what happened to Christianity from that time about 400 years ago to the present. And it is that many Christians and many of the great thinkers in the Christian world began to lose their confidence that God was an agent, that he could act. And they began to lose their confidence that the Bible story could make sense to modern people. And based on that, they began to try to find a way to, what would you say, pull Christianity's coals out of the fire. Make sense of Christianity for modern people. The beginning of the 19th century, there was a famous book by a Protestant theologian named Schleiermacher, and the book was called On Religion, Lectures for Its Cultured Despisers. He was trying to redeem Christianity. He was trying to make sense of it for the cultural elites for whom this had come to seem like something old-fashioned and incoherent. Hard to make sense of it. There came a time when Christian thinkers began to worry that the faith had fallen into disrepute and they needed to help it. They would defend it, and this is what I'm going to give you a few examples of this. They came to defend Christianity by telling its cultured despisers, people who look down on the faith, what it was really saying. That's the claim. In other words, it wasn't a matter of rejecting Christianity. It wasn't a matter of people, there were lots of people who did reject Christianity. There were, for the first time, lots of explicit atheists in Europe. But it was a matter of defending it in a particular kind of way, saying, no, 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 don't make fun of it, don't reject it. It seems to be saying this, it's hard for you to make sense of it, but it's really saying underneath it all something else. That was the strategy. Reasons were necessary to be given to the cultured despisers, lest it fall into disrepute. This was probably the first time that this had happened since the earliest days of the Christian movement, right? In the early days, Christianity was a minority movement in the Roman Empire. They had to give arguments, mostly so they wouldn't be persecuted. Then Christianity pretty much ran the show in the West, right? Up until the modern period. So probably about 200 years ago, people first had to worry about how to explain this to culture despisers who had their doubts. Okay, so that's my claim. In the modern era, people began to have these kind of doubts, and defenders of the faith of a certain kind said, we're going to defend it by saying, no, 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 let me explain to you what Christianity is really saying. Let me stress that I'm not saying that everything that only scholarship and thinking is what matters, right? That's part of life. Lots of other things were happening in society, like the Industrial Revolution. Philosophers and theologians are part of the picture, but they aren't the whole thing. But it is true that how people think about a religion matters because it gives people a way of imagining the world, right? Other things matter too, how people work and how people play and how people have wars and all kinds of things. But thinking about the faith does matter because it gives you a kind of landscape into which you can put the rest of the world. A modern Catholic philosopher named Charles Taylor calls it a social imaginary. What religion gives you is a way of imagining the world. And there was a traditional Christian way of imagining the world. It came to be under assault in the modern world, and then certain people tried to defend it I'll let you make up your own mind what you make. So I want to present some of the major alternatives that happened in the modern world since 1800, in which people told you what Christianity really means. With each one, I want to give you a famous thinker, but the names don't really matter. As I offer these, I want to describe after them some of the more dire interpretations. So there were some people who were Christians who said, no, 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 don't be scandalized. The Christians are really saying this. And then by the end of the 9th century, came along some famous people who were not defenders in any way, who flat out said the whole thing is bunk. Let me tell you why. Okay? And all of those people affect, this is my claim, understanding what happened influences the kind of world we live in, even as more traditional believers in the Christian faith. Again, ideas aren't the whole thing. Even Radin was here last week, and he said the biggest influence on Anglicanism was not this thinker or that, this idea or that. He said in the modern era, the biggest influence was World War I, which killed an extraordinary number of the young, rising leaders of England and created a whole wave of despair and culture, which led to very bad things. So anyway, there are a lot of other things other than just people sitting and writing books. But books are good too. I want to suggest that there are three major answers to the question, what does Christianity really mean by these defenders of the faith? One was ethics, one was feeling, and one was history, right? So a great thinker came along and said, no, Christianity is actually good because it's really saying something about ethics. Christianity is really good because it's really saying something about religious feeling. Christianity is really good because it's really saying something about history. That's what they did. First, let me lay my own cards on the table, face up. I think that the need for such answers was the product of a particular kind of cultural and historical crisis. The crisis of faith. And the crisis of confidence. In other words, Christianity doesn't have to be renegotiated these ways, but they were living in a particular moment. It would be interesting to ask yourself, how does Christianity today get renegotiated because of the kind of crisis we live in? I think we inherit some of these answers. There may be other answers as well. In fact, traditional Christianity had its own answer about why this crisis took place and what it meant. And we can learn from it. Such a crisis and these particular answers aren't necessary. And furthermore, each of these thinkers we're going to talk about has something valid to say. Each one has something valid to say about the implications of the Christian life. Each one was coming to terms with something real, like the shock of science, or the new way people were thinking about historical texts. In fact, traditional Christianity made room for all this. Traditional Christianity allowed people to ask questions like that. And the narrative could be read, it continues to be read, in a way that could come to terms with these new challenges. In other words, these answers are understandable because Christianity does have something to say about moral life, something to say about religious feelings, something to say about history, right? Well, what these authors were doing is making that the centerpiece of what Christianity really is. Most of all, here's the big deal. In each of these answers I'm going to give you, Christianity is not making a claim about how the world really is. Right? That's the big thing that happened in the modern world. Each one is saying, you know, Christianity is about something else. How you should live. What kind of feelings you have in the face of the infinite. Right? Where we're going on the great ride into human history. Right? But in each case, it wasn't saying Christianity is true. The way geometry or physics might be true. And that's a huge, huge shift. The first answer is the ethical. Right? We're going to give you three ways modern people, certain kinds of modern people, renegotiate. The first one's ethics. The argument goes like this. We can't really know God. All we have are pictures of something that's simply beyond our understanding. What was the traditional answer to that? The traditional answer said, you're right, it's beyond our understanding, and he himself has spoken, right? Thomas Aquinas and Martin Luther thought God was beyond your understanding, right? But he's decided to speak. Scripture. Okay. So the first one goes like this. We cannot know God. We have certain pictures which form our understanding of what's beyond our understanding. And these help us live good lives. We live under a king, so we don't misbehave. He's got his eye on us, right? We're headed toward heaven, where there'll be hell, too. So also a motivator to stay on the path. These beliefs are conditions for the possibility of living a good life. But they're not really truth claims. They're not telling you how things really are. Going back to undergraduate, the great big name in this case is an 18th century philosopher called Immanuel Kant. The things we say about God are useful, politically as well. You know, the idea of God keeps civilizations in order, right? They have something to organize themselves around. Could be Shiva, right? Could be Allah. Could be the God of Israel, right? But you need, and then there's a whole debate in the modern era. What happens when you try to organize a society around no God at all. That's one of the big themes in modern political thought. But at any rate, you see the argument. Argument number one is that all these things they say are true are really ways of simply inducing people to act well. And if the goal is moral action, one might want to adjust what you say to make them act better, right? In other words, you say these things religiously in order to, with certain kinds of ethical ends. So you might want to shift what you say to have different ethical ends. For instance, in contemporary society, you might want to call God she as well as he to render to make society a less gender-biased society, right? So if the goal is ethics, you would adjust how you talk to make society come out a different way. One problem with option number one, it may seem overly intellectual. It's premised on an argument about how religion works. It supposes that human beings make reasonable moral choices. This is a very dubious assumption. Forgive me, adolescent kids. But this is hardly a full account of how people are motivated to do what they do, right? People have deeper and more mysterious forces that motivate them. What keep people like psychotherapists, like my wife, in business. We might add that the Kantian alternative is associated with the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a rationalist way of looking at things. They supposed that with reason, the darkness was being dispelled continuously in human society. And what was the great death of that notion? Enlightened, progressive society, superior moral order of Western Europe, right? Go back to what I said earlier. And the death knell to that was a bunch of Protestant Lutherans and a bunch of Protestant Anglicans slaughtering each other for 4 years across the trenches. Not so morally superior. All right, so where do we go from there? Human beings are not so rational as they seem. The next movement is a movement called Romanticism, right? The fellow I mentioned, Schleiermacher, is an example of that. You may have remembered reading Romanticist poets in high school or college. It puts the spotlight on everything else in the human person. We aren't just little brains, little computers walking around, balanced on our shoulders. What about emotion? What about the artistic? What about genius that strains against the bounds of the acceptable? I've been riding around listening to classical music on the station here, and they've been playing Beethoven, right? And if ever there was music which expresses genius, right, which is just surging ahead of the mere mortal, it's him. What about the exotic? What about people who march to a different drummer? What about the wisdom of Tahiti or the wisdom of native people? All of this was discovered in the 19th century. Lots of books about native wisdom. What about ecology? They discovered in the Romanticist movement nature. They're all out taking woods and taking walks in Grantchester outside Cambridge and looking at the trees. The whole different idea that somehow you would find wisdom in the natural world. What about cultural diversity, discovered in the 19th century, Romanticists? And furthermore, what about people who break the bounds, even sexual transgression? You look at somebody like Shelley or Lord Byron, right, who were rakes, right, who were bad boys, and somehow they were finding truth and beauty. All of that was in Romanticism. Very important movement, right? The heart of the human being is to express yourself, right? Ancient people didn't think there was a need to express. They thought you were supposed to be living according to some ideal, right? But this is a modern idea. I have come to the conclusion that a lot of Anglicanism is different kinds of Romanticism, right? Anglican Catholicism is a kind of medievalist Romanticism, and a lot of progressivism is a kind of Rousseauian Romanticism. So Romanticism is a big deal in our culture. Self-expression, diversity, ecology. Sounds familiar. As to the argument from Schleiermacher, it goes like this. Religion has to do with what you feel in the face of the infinite, which you aren't. The infinite also means the eternal, which we mortals aren't. It makes us feel needy. It makes us feel small. It makes us feel a sense of wonder and awe. And religion is all of that. Everything you feel in the face of the infinite. These are a bunch of stories that describe all that. And the greatest story of all is the Incarnation, where God himself enters into this, blesses this feeling of dependency and smallness. Schleiermacher actually wrote a book in which he correlated every single thing Christians believe with one of these feelings. So think about that. So the second answer was Christianity is not to be discarded, oh you modern people, because it is the best description of religious feeling. Religious experience, you might say, right? What we might call spirituality. I'm going to keep telling you my punchline here. So my point is does Christianity have something to say about ethics? I hope so. Does Christianity have something to say about religion? Does it order people's religious experience? Of course. But this is a stronger claim. Christianity really is about this diversity. The description of religion as feeling is a general one. But if you think about it, there's a problem. Because there's such a thing as religious experience, and then there's each of our experiences, right? Nobody's the same. So in fact, you end up not with one religious experience, but about 10 million of them. This is a problem. And it tends, the sort of dissipating, fragmented nature of modern life is reinforced. We've considered moral action and feeling as ways to get underneath the Bible's actual story and say what it's about. The third option, to make the gospel acceptable to what Schleiermacher called cultural despisers, is what we might call cultural trend, or maybe history. Where it's all going. What's happening now? Right? Is there a kind of sweep, a kind of direction? Is the whole thing sailing where? Right? That's traditional Christianity thought that history was headed somewhere, namely the kingdom of God. But that got translated in the modern world into a sense that history, in a more closer to the ground or a more immediate sense, was headed somewhere. Some in the modern world said it was headed nowhere. It was random. It was headed to whatever was next. But there were also some who claimed that it had a kind of great direction. The big think name here is Hegel. He's totally impossible to read. I had a teacher who was once very proud that when her book closed by accident, she opened the book again and realized she was in a different chapter. She said up until then the chapters all seemed the same. But at any rate, here's what we think he was saying. If you think about words like the other, or evolution, or cultural context, or the meaning of history, he invented all that. He believed that history was going somewhere. It was marching toward what he called the realization of spirit. So any kind of modern interpretation of the world that thinks the whole thing is headed toward, I don't know, freedom, say, or the classless society, or that's option 3. In this third case, the place you look is actual human history, trying to find the grand sweep. Is the world an ongoing process of the actualization of truth? Well, it depends on whose truth, right? I mean, people see different things. They look at history. This is one of the problems. Hegel was claimed, like each of these, in each case, he was a Christian, but he thought the Bible was what he called picture thinking, right? It was for people who weren't up to reading Hegel. And that, in fact, where it was all going was kind of hidden. That may be a common theme in human nature. that the specifics of faith point to something else, right? That's what I'm saying. In the modern world, to defend the faith, there were three different ways to say, no, 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 it's not, don't reject it, it's really this, and that makes sense, right? Well, once they opened that can of worms, there were other deeper problems. This idea of rethinking the faith was picked up by a number of characters who were not Christians at all. As I say, the great thinkers in the first wave were all unorthodox, but Christians. Thinkers of the second wave came along and they meant to debunk faith. They thought it was all bogus. It was a cover for something else. And there are three of them too. Karl Marx said that faith was opium, so that someone could give this to people who were oppressed and they wouldn't pay attention, and then they could abuse them. Ideas in general, religious ideas in particular, are just covers for economic interest. The money distract the poor lest they rise up against the oppressors, offering them pie in the sky when you die. So that's debunking idea number one. Debunking idea number two is Sigmund Freud. Religious faith is just people projecting their fears and desires on some big picture of God up in the sky, right? We want our own father was somehow insufficient or frustrating, and we look for a great father in the sky. Sigmund Freud called Christianity infantile neurosis. Not a very nice thing to say. The third radical answer was Nietzsche. Nietzsche's answer goes like this. All this thing about civilization and thought is all a dodge. That human beings are actually not progressed hardly at all from the jungle. They might as well be a panther. It's all a matter of power. Religion is a trick that the mediocre play so as to wrest control from the great and the powerful, right? And it would be better that the great and powerful simply take over. I'm tempted to make political comments, but I absolutely will not. Under torture, I will not make a political comment. I'll leave that to you. In each case, we can see traces of this thinking in our own world, right? You know, I'll give you an example. And again, my goal is more descriptive. If you look at something like contemporary liberation theology, it is a way of saying that the story of the Bible is about liberation. Exodus is a liberation story, and that you can read in the Bible a warrant, encouragement toward human process of liberation. Pastoral counseling is a way of saying Christianity is, in addition to whatever else it is, it's also a way to come to terms with yourself, so that you can find a kind of peace, and that your personality can be integrated. One of the problems with that is, if you ever read the lives of the saints, I mean, they were not all integrated a lot, but at any rate, you see the idea. So some of these, my point is that these are not simply left behind in history, but they're alive and well. I have already begun to offer examples of the ways in which these trends of thought come into play. Mind you, I am not saying that this or that course of action isn't right, only that the reasons that were given along the way undercut what the faith is. I think there's a certain element of truth in each of these, right? Christianity does provide not just a philosophy, but a way of living. It does, I mean, the life of prayer is related to our feelings, and we do think history goes. But there is a major baby and bathwater problem in modern Christian life. That's my point. You would not want to make these arguments in such a way that the idea that Christianity tells you what is true, how the world actually is, the social imaginary, that the landscape you can put the rest of reality in, you would not want to leave that behind. It may be that the gospel wants the oppressed class liberated. True. But that isn't the same thing as saying that that is the gospel. That's an implication of the gospel, right? It isn't, you wouldn't say that's the real story is the process of liberation. The real story is the story. And then its implication, you miss that. It may be that where we are faithful, we are more integrated psychologically. A friend of mine, when I made that statement once, compared it to the thing in Narnia about wherever Aslan goes, flowers tend to bloom, right? When the Aslans come back to life, things tend to bloom. Which is a way of saying, where there is the gospel, you shouldn't be surprised that something gets healed or integrated. But Christianity isn't the same thing as psychological integration. It's a gift that you get by God's will as a result of it. But Christianity is its own claim. Likewise, you take someone who says everything is just power, right? Everything's just dominance. Everything's just somebody trying to get something from somebody else. Sounds like the book of Ecclesiastes, right? But that's one book, and the Bible has a lot more things to say. So that's my argument. My argument is that Christianity came into a particular kind of crisis, and certain ways of trying to, quote, help it, in fact, were true in a certain way, but lost track of the fact that Christianity is its own claim about truth, with its own story, which the story of Christianity is the story of Christianity. It's not a cover for some other story underneath. But these are all alive and well, and they inhabit large stretches of the contemporary religious landscape. All right, so that's what I came to tell you. I want to spend my last few minutes undercutting my own statement. I don't know why people want to do that, but they do. Let me just balance this out. All of this says that the way people think about the faith matters, right? And that sometimes people can be partially right, and that has its own problems. But I also think that it's not that simple. Because I also believe that one of the decisive things that's happened in the modern world is the marketplace. And the dominant metaphor for almost everything in our culture is buying and selling. Right? If you want to understand our culture, go to Tom Thumb and look at 50 kinds of toothpaste. Right? We do that to everything, and we're really, really good at it. Right? We turn everything into a commodity or a strategy, right? And we try to, and we know how to advance it. That's our culture. It's not good or bad. It's people in Papua have culture. People in Ghana have culture. People in the United States have culture, and it's called Tom Thumb. That's what we do, right? Healthcare. Whoever thought that healthcare would be a product, right? Do you know what I mean? It's a profession. But for us, now, is that bad? No, because doing it smartly makes it more accessible to more people. But all I'm trying to say is that's our culture. We commodify things. And we have done that to religion as well. We make it a choice which is an answer to human needs, right? That's what we do to everything else. It is not surprising that we do that to religion. But does that capture what religion is? It does not, right? There's a wonderful expression which is taken from the book of Exodus by St. Augustine called despoiling the Egyptians. In the story, on their way out toward the Red Sea, they took all their gold, right? And it was Augustine's way of saying, we should borrow stuff from the pagans. We should borrow from the culture, right? Liberally, but on our own terms. Can we use the idea of the marketplace? We better. It's who we are. Anyway, my point is it isn't just in our head, it's also in our economic system, how we see the world. We naturally assume that human beings are units who make decisions about what they want and don't want. And we assume at times that religion is a spiritual product we choose or don't. And we want to think about how to make it more attractive and hope people will choose it. I spend some of my life doing stuff like that, so I get that, but it's not the whole picture, right? Second thing I want to say is I think it matters hugely, tied to that. It matters, and you can see how that fits into this, right? if the product is religious feeling, then you want to know what makes people feel different ways, and you want to. Second big thing is technology. I think that makes a huge, huge difference in our culture. I believe that more and more of our relationships are mediated by machines, right? You know, I just had a session today thinking, and I used to teach theological courses online, right? Machines were mediating cyber images of students. Makes it accessible to people who can't get it. You can see the connection between buying and selling, the machine, and ourselves. And it affects how we think about human beings. We become, there's a me inside personally, right? Who's kind of subjective and hidden away, and I relate through these mediated machines to an objective world where I express, realize, or don't my religious needs. This is just what we're increasingly like, and it's what the gospel doesn't settle for whatever it finds culturally. That's my point, right? The gospel can work with anything. Missionaries encounter everything, and it challenges it. What's all this got to do with Christianity? What we make of Christianity? If there is another level of what it really means, then they could be compared or defended as conforming to what is needed, which is related to what we want, at least in our mind. In other words, in our culture, pragmatism and functionalism are important, and naturally that makes these factors suitable or congenial to our American spirit. Let me end. Does all this mean that we are doomed to live in such a time? The answer is, of course we're doomed. We are all bound. If by that I mean, are we bound to be the kind of people we are? Do we have the kind of limitations that our time and place put on us? Of course. All human beings live in some time or place, and the culture puts some limitation on them, right? In other words, we can't jump out of our skin. This is part of our history. Technology, buying and selling, pragmatism, these are all part of who we are. But if the question is whether the Word of God can still speak in spite of these constraints, or whether the Spirit can still act here and among us and change things, then the answer is also obvious. For humans, it is impossible. For God, all things are possible. Right? The gospel is every bit as capable of challenging, working with, borrowing from the Egyptians, transforming what we are like, as it has been when it found the Papuans, or the people in Ghana, or my Saxon ancestors with their idols. To be sure, it is a good question to ask yourself, what are the social conditions? What are the educational requirements that would make it most likely that the gospel could be heard and the story understood for what it is in our day? That's a lot of what theology does. But this alone does not suffice. It is not enough to try to think your way into solving some of these dilemmas. The freedom and the efficacy of the Word of God are required. So let me sum up. Let me recap. I have described what happened to Christianity in certain circles in the modern world in a way that I hope you can see is still floating out there. And I've done so in a way, I hope, which isn't all negative. These are all partially true. But they aren't the whole story in the modern world. There have also been a string of Christians who have rediscovered what one of them, Karl Barth, called the strange new world of the gospel. You know the famous story, he was a Swiss pastor, and he was in his pulpit, and he was preaching the kind of message he had inherited. Christianity as moral uplift, Christianity as sort of socially evolved, Christianity as good examples of moral action. And he heard the canons between the French and the Germans in the distance. And what the canon said to him was, human beings are stranger and more broken than the kind of philosophy he had been given in the modern world. And then he rediscovered this thing he called the strange new world. Here are some of the features of what it means to continually rediscover this voice. First of all, the Bible is a coherent story that upholds a social imaginary, a distinctive way of seeing the world. And that means it does claim truth. It says the world is really like this. This is the best account of the world. It's a funny way to make a truth claim through a long, long story, which meanders through a lot of Middle Eastern history, right? And trying to figure that out is important. And ask it questions. But just the same, it is a story that we can readily understand. That's the point of the creed. The story has a center, the death and resurrection of Jesus. And that the first thing is not some story that it really means behind it, but it is its own story. And you can get its contour and get its center. There are lots of things that are hard to understand it, and people will continue to debate those. Second of all, we have to assume a missionary encounter with modern culture. It's a very important idea among Christians in recent couple of generations. That we have to rediscover the idea that there's a missionary encounter with what we see around us, right? And that's always hard. I mean, when the gospel came to Papua, the people in Papua figured that's just what the world is like, you know? And the gospel told them something different, and they had to rearrange their thinking. Well, we have to do that as well. And some of that has come from actual real-life missionaries coming back to Europe and saying, wait a minute, this isn't just Christianity, this culture. It's as challengeable as what I saw in India. Third of all, we have to make peace. We have to readily acknowledge that the gospel does have these kind of implications, and that there is a conversation to be had with modern, postmodern liberal culture. But these do not define what the Christian story is. And therefore, you and I have to think about what it means to be a community in which the story could be heard realistically. We could think about this missionary encounter with a kind of constructive engagement with the world in which we live, right? That's, I'll end with one last quote. One of the great rediscoverers of this way of seeing things, Leslie Newbigin, came back from India, went to England, and all of a sudden realized this is just as missionary as South Indian Hindu culture, right? Modern England. And he had a famous sentence. He said, the key to interpreting the Bible is the local congregation, right? Not just a place to get solace or help or, all these kind of things we want to. But actually the best way to understand what the gospel was saying was to hear the gospel in the context of people who were struggling, reconciled, worshiping every week, trying to understand the neighborhood in which God had placed them, trying to find this friendly, challenging relationship to the culture, trying to relearn the world in the social imaginary of the gospel. He thought that local congregations were the interpretive key, little mini seminaries, or better yet, for understanding what the gospel has to say. So there you are, that's modern theology. Cheaper than a whole year of Wycliffe College, let me tell you that.